Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sleepy Shadows. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and fall asleep. If today was long or heavy, I'll do my best to make your night a little more comfortable with these stories. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy calm, quiet horror stories like these, you're welcome to subscribe. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin. I knew him only through Facebook, but for a few years, he was one of those people whose presence felt real, even through a screen. He was kind, funny, thoughtful. The kind of person who commented on posts with genuine interest, who checked in on people, who made the internet feel a little more human. We weren't best friends, but he was someone I liked and respected, someone whose posts I always read. One morning, I opened Facebook like I did every day, scrolling through the usual mix of updates, photos, and opinions. And then I saw his post. It stood out immediately, not because it was dramatic or alarming, but because it was long, carefully written, detailed. The kind of post someone makes when a dream lingers long after waking. He had written about a nightmare he'd just had. At first, it read like a piece of fiction, almost cinematic, but he described hanging out with people, having a couple of drinks, casual conversation. Everything felt normal, comfortable, familiar. Then the ground shook slightly, just enough to be noticeable. Then the lights went out. Total darkness. No power. In the dream, they wandered outside. The entire neighborhood was dark. No streetlights, no houses lit. Just people standing around, confused but not panicked yet. They kept drinking, waiting, assuming the power would come back. Then he noticed something on the horizon. A strange orange glow. Not where the sun would be rising or setting. Somewhere wrong. Somewhere it shouldn't be. And it felt warm. Sirens started to sound in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder. Cell service was gone. No one knew what was happening. People started to feel uneasy. The glow grew brighter, or the heat increased. Then they saw people running toward them, burned, bleeding, screaming, people whose bodies were already damaged, whose panic was contagious. They couldn't speak properly, only cry and scream. For a moment, everyone froze, unable to understand what they were seeing. Then they saw it. A wall of flame, rolling forward, consuming everything in its path. The runners were swallowed one by one, disappearing into fire. Their screams cut off instantly. That was the moment the dream shifted fully into terror. He described how everyone scattered at once, like a school of fish reacting to a predator. Sudden, frantic movement in all directions. And then he was alone. He knew he was doomed. He tried to escape anyway, but it felt pointless. He couldn't find shelter. He couldn't outrun it. As the heat felt like a massive blowtorch aimed directly at him. He wondered how much dying would hurt, whether it would be quick. Then the flames reached him. He was on fire. The pain was unbearable. He was terrified. And then he woke up. At the end of the post, he tried to make light of it. He joked that his back pain must have worked its way into his sleep and built a story around itself. He said he needed coffee, maybe counseling. He framed it as one of those vivid nightmares your brain creates when your body is uncomfortable. At the time, that explanation seemed reasonable. People commented with concern, with jokes, with empathy. Someone said it sounded like anxiety. Someone else said they'd had similar dreams. I read it, felt unsettled for a moment, and then kept scrolling. Nightmares happen. People post strange dreams all the time. There was no reason to think it meant anything. The next night, his room caught on fire. He died. I don't remember how I found out, whether it was another post, a message, or someone else sharing the news. I just remember the sudden, sickening realization as the pieces connected in my mind. The dream, the fire, the way he described being trapped, the way he described the heat, the way he described knowing he was doomed, the way he described being on fire. I went back and reread his post, slowly, line by line. It felt different now. Not prophetic in a supernatural sense, not a warning sent from beyond, but horrifying in its coincidence. The timing was unbearable. The details were too close for comfort, the imagery too specific. I know rational explanations exist. Stress, pain, anxiety. The human brain is capable of generating vivid, symbolic nightmares. Fires are a common fear. Death dreams happen. Correlation is not causation. I know all of that. And still, it creeps me out. 7 years later, it still creeps me out. Because even if the dream didn't predict anything, even if it was pure coincidence, the human mind struggles with patterns like that. We're wired to search for meaning, to connect dots, to wonder if something was sensed before it happened. What bothers me most isn't the idea that he foresaw his death. It's the idea that his last public words described terror so vividly, that the last thing he shared with the world was a story about being trapped, alone, engulfed by fire. That the nightmare he laughed off became reality less than 24 hours later. I think about how many people read that post and moved on, never knowing what would happen next. How ordinary it felt in the moment. Just another late-night ramble from someone trying to shake off a bad dream. And then he was gone. There's a specific kind of grief that comes with internet friendships. You don't always get the full story. You don't always know what happened. You don't attend funerals or hear voices break while speaking. You just watch a profile go silent. One day someone is posting jokes and dreams. The next, nothing. The account becomes a digital ghost, frozen in time. Comments piling up under the last post. Messages that will never be answered. Every once in a while, I still think about him, about that post, about how casually we brush past moments that later feel enormous in hindsight, about how fragile the line between ordinary life and disaster really is. I think about pain, about how the body communicates distress in strange ways, about how back pain, illness, stress, and fear can manifest as stories when we sleep. And I think about fire, about how fast it moves, how unforgiving it is, how it doesn't care about intentions or explanations. I don't believe the dream caused anything. I don't believe he was cursed or warned. But I do believe that coincidence can be cruel in ways that feel almost personal. That sometimes reality mirrors our fears so closely that it feels intentional, even when it isn't. And that some stories stick with us not because they prove anything, but because they remind us how thin the walls are between imagination and experience, between sleep and waking, between one ordinary day and the end of a life. That Facebook post still exists somewhere, saved by people who can't forget it. A nightmare written down, and then lived. And that is something I don't think I will ever fully be comfortable with. This happened in the late 1970s, back when life felt slower and quieter in ways that are hard to explain to people who didn't grow up around open land. At the time, my family was living on a small ranch south of San Antonio. It wasn't a big operation, just enough land to keep livestock, fix fences, and live the kind of life where you know every sound your property makes at night. Out there, you learn what's normal. You learn the difference between coyotes and dogs, between wind and something moving through brush. You learn when cattle are restless and when something is wrong. The land teaches you patterns, and when those patterns break, you feel it immediately. Our nearest neighbor was a man named Frank. Frank wasn't strange. He wasn't the type people whisper about. He was practical, hard-working, and quiet in the way a lot of ranchers are. He didn't drink. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't tell stories just to scare people. He minded his business and expected others to do the same. One day, Frank came over and asked if we could help him unload a bull he had just purchased. This wasn't unusual. Ranchers help each other all the time. Moving livestock is easier and safer with extra hands, especially when it's a bull. This one was special to him. It was a registered Brahmin bull, newly purchased, and Frank was clearly proud of it. He told us the bull's registered name was Cornelius. Brahmin cattle are tough animals. Big, muscular, known for their endurance and resistance to heat. A full-grown Brahmin bull is not something that goes down easily. We went over to help him unload Cornelius into a holding pen near his back pasture, which bordered ours. The idea was to let the cows get used to him before fully integrating him into the herd. Everything went smoothly. The bull was strong, alert, and healthy. No signs of injury, no signs of stress beyond what you'd expect from transport. Cornelius looked exactly like a Brahmin bull should look. Powerful. Alive. We finished up, said our goodbyes, and went back to our place. There was nothing about that day that stood out as strange. It was just another ranch chore in a long line of ordinary days. The next morning, Frank came back. He didn't look angry. He didn't look panicked. He looked unsettled. He asked us a simple question. "Did you see or hear anything unusual last night?" We told him no. The night had been quiet. No noises, no gunshots, no animals spooked, no dogs barking unusually. Nothing out of the ordinary. Frank nodded but didn't look relieved. Then he told us Cornelius was dead. That immediately raised alarm bells. A Brahmin bull doesn't just drop dead overnight, not without reason. Disease, injury, predators, poisoning. There's always something. We all went with him to the back pasture. Cornelius was lying on his side. No blood, no obvious wounds. Just some superficial scratches on his neck and hindquarters. Nothing deep. Nothing that would explain death. No signs of a struggle that matched what it would take to bring down an animal that size. No tracks that made sense. No evidence of predators capable of killing a full-grown Brahmin bull in that area. Coyotes wouldn't do that. Mountain lions were rare and would have left very different signs. Nothing added up. Standing there, looking at that animal, everyone felt it. That quiet discomfort that settles in when logic fails. Ranchers are practical people. We don't jump to strange conclusions. But we also trust experience, and experience told us this wasn't normal. The cause of death was never determined. No one could explain it. Over time, the story would have ended there, if not for what came later. Not long after that incident, my dad mentioned something Frank had said to him privately. Frank claimed that on the night Cornelius died, he saw something in that pasture. A woman. Except she didn't have a head. My dad didn't tell this to scare us. He told it because he didn't know what to make of it. Frank wasn't the kind of man who made things up. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't prone to superstition, and he wasn't seeking attention. According to Frank, he had seen a headless woman in the back pasture. Not running, not attacking, just there. Frank never elaborated much beyond that. He didn't describe clothes. He didn't describe movement, just the presence. Enough to make him certain of what he had seen, and certain enough that it changed his behavior permanently. From that point on, Frank never went into that pasture after dark, not once. This was a man who had worked land his entire life, who had walked pastures at night countless times, who knew his property like the back of his hand. And yet, after that night, he avoided that area once the sun went down. He warned us, too. Not dramatically, not urgently, just matter of fact. He told us to be careful. Told us not to go into that pasture at night if we didn't have to. That warning alone was enough to unsettle us. We never saw the woman, headless or otherwise. We never heard anything unusual ourselves. No voices, no footsteps, no animals behaving strangely in a way we could definitively link to that pasture. But something had changed. The pasture felt different after that. Not in a way you could point to, but in a way you noticed. People stopped lingering there at dusk. We didn't let curiosity override caution. The bull's death remained unexplained. Years passed, and we never heard of another incident like it. No more cattle deaths, no more sightings. Life went on, as it usually does, even when something strange interrupts it. But Frank never changed his behavior. Even years later, after enough time had passed that most people would have chalked it up to imagination or coincidence, Frank still wouldn't go into that pasture after dark. That consistency mattered. People can exaggerate once. They don't usually live their lives around a lie. Looking back now, what unsettles me most isn't the image of a headless woman. It's the combination of things that don't fit together. A healthy bull dying overnight with no clear cause. A man with no history of drinking or superstition claiming to see something impossible. A permanent change in behavior that never softened with time. And a warning that came not with fear, but with certainty. I don't know what happened in that pasture. I don't know what Frank saw. I don't know if the two things are connected or if the human mind tries to link unrelated events when faced with the unexplainable. What I do know is that something broke the pattern. And when patterns break on land, you know well, you pay attention. Even now, decades later, the memory sticks with me. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. Because there was no resolution, no explanation, no story ending that made it safe to forget. Just a dead bull, a man who changed, and a pasture no one wanted to walk through after dark. Sometimes the most unsettling stories aren't the ones filled with chaos or violence. They're the ones where something happens, no one understands it, and life simply adjusts around it, leaving the question unanswered forever. This happened in August of 2020, during the first wave of COVID, back when everything about it was still uncertain and terrifying. There were no vaccines yet. Information changed every day. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and people were dying alone. I had caught the original version, and it nearly killed me. I don't say that lightly. For days, I was barely functional. Breathing felt like work. Standing up made the room spin. I slept in fragments, drifting in and out of consciousness, never quite sure what time it was. My body felt weak, in a way I had never experienced before. It wasn't just being sick. It felt like my system was failing piece by piece. By the time this happened, I was technically getting better. But that didn't mean I was well. It meant I wasn't actively getting worse anymore. My body was still exhausted. My brain felt foggy. Simple thoughts took effort. I was drained in a way that went deeper than physical fatigue. One night, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't gradual. I didn't drift awake. I snapped into consciousness, heart already racing, like something had pulled me out of sleep instead of me waking naturally. The room was dim, lit only by faint ambient light from outside. And immediately, I saw someone standing next to my bed. There was no hesitation in my perception, no confusion, no sense of maybe. I saw a person. He was standing close, right beside the bed, near where I would normally get up. He wasn't facing me directly. He was turned slightly away, about 3/4 profile, as if he had been looking at something else and I had just noticed him. I remember details that still make my skin crawl. He had short hair. Not messy. Or not long. Just ordinary. He was wearing a plaid shirt, tucked neatly into a pair of jeans. Nothing dramatic. Nothing ghostly. No flowing clothes. No distortion. He looked solid. Normal. Real. That's what made it so horrifying. My first thought wasn't ghost. It wasn't hallucination. It was someone is in my room. For a split second, my brain tried to rationalize it. I thought maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe my eyes were still adjusting. Maybe my fever-damaged brain was misfiring. So I did the most logical thing I could think of. I stood up. I wanted to change my perspective. I wanted to confirm that what I was seeing would disappear once my angle shifted, once my brain corrected itself. But he didn't disappear. He was still there, just as clear, just as solid, standing exactly where he had been. Of course, that's when panic fully took over. My heart slammed against my chest. Every nerve in my body lit up at once. The part of my brain responsible for calm reasoning shut off completely. I didn't think. I reacted. I started screaming, not yelling, not calling out. Screaming. The kind of raw, uncontrolled sound that comes from pure terror. At the same time, I reached up and yanked the cord on the ceiling fan to turn on the light. The moment the light came on, he was gone. Gone instantly. No fading. No movement. No stepping back into shadows. Just not there anymore. The room was exactly the same as it had always been. Empty. Quiet. Normal. I stood there shaking, my throat raw, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break my ribs. My hands were trembling. I could barely breathe, not because of COVID this time, but because of shock. I checked the room. I checked the corners. The door. The closet. I knew it was pointless, but my body needed proof. Needed confirmation that I was alone. There was no one there. I didn't sleep after that. I lay in bed with the light on until morning, staring at the space where he had stood, replaying it over and over in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him again. The shirt, the posture, the way he hadn't reacted to me at all. What unsettled me most wasn't just the fear. It was how real it had felt. I've had dreams. I've had sleep paralysis. I've had moments of confusion before. None of them felt like this. This wasn't fuzzy. This wasn't vague. This wasn't dreamlike. This felt exactly like seeing another human being in the room. The next day, and the days after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to be rational. I tried to tell myself it was a hallucination caused by COVID, fever, exhaustion, oxygen deprivation, or stress. All of those explanations made sense on paper, but emotionally, none of them fit. Because I had never experienced anything like that before. And I haven't since. Months later, when I finally saw a neurologist, I told him about it. I was genuinely worried. COVID was already being linked to neurological damage, brain inflammation, long-term cognitive issues. I wanted to know if something had gone wrong in my brain. I described the experience carefully, the clarity, the details, the fact that it persisted even after I stood up. He didn't interrupt me. When I finished, he just looked at me, not with confusion, not with concern, just a long, unreadable stare. Then he changed the subject. No reassurance, no explanation, no follow-up questions. That response unsettled me almost as much as the experience itself. Doctors usually either explain things away or investigate further. The silence felt like avoidance. At the time, I was living in a house that was over 200 years old. The kind of place that creaks and settles and carries history in its walls. I had never been particularly afraid of that fact before. Old houses don't scare me. But after that night, I couldn't help thinking about it. I wondered who had lived there before, who had slept in that room, who had stood exactly where that figure had stood. I don't claim it was a ghost. I don't claim it wasn't. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that it scared me in a way nothing else ever has. Not because it was violent or threatening, but because it shattered my trust in my own perception. If my brain could produce something that real, that detailed, that convincing, what else could it do? And if it wasn't my brain, then what was it? That question has no comfortable answer. Even now, years later, I still think about it sometimes when I wake up at night. I still feel that jolt of adrenaline when I open my eyes in a dark room. I still glance at that space beside the bed before I relax. The experience didn't turn me into a believer or a skeptic. It didn't give me clarity. It just left me with uncertainty and fear. Not fear of ghosts or illness, but fear of how thin the line is between what we assume is real and what we experience as real. Because for a few seconds that night, there was a man standing next to my bed, and I saw him as clearly as I have ever seen anything in my life. Then he was gone, and nothing since has ever explained that well enough to make it stop haunting me. This is not my story directly, but it is one that lived close enough to my family that it feels like it brushed against us. It's one of those things that doesn't fade with time, even when the details blur. The emotional weight stays exactly the same. One of my dad's close friends had a younger brother. They weren't estranged. They weren't distant. They were just brothers, living their lives, the way people do before something happens that splits time into before and after. Years ago, the family took a trip together. It wasn't anything dramatic or unusual, just people traveling, spending time together, doing what families do. At some point during that trip, the younger brother went missing. It wasn't immediate chaos. Not at first. There's always that early window where everyone assumes the person will turn up. Maybe they wandered off. But maybe they missed a ride. Maybe they went somewhere without telling anyone. People convince themselves it's nothing because the alternative is too heavy to sit with. But as hours passed, and then a full day, the fear set in. That's when my dad got the call. It was right after the disappearance. His friend was frantic, panicked in a way that only happens when someone realizes they're losing control of a situation that matters more than anything. He asked my dad if there was anything he could do to help escalate the search. My dad had worked adjacent to law enforcement for a period of time and still had contacts. The friend wanted to know if higher-level authorities could get involved, if official search parties could be organized faster, if something more could be done before time slipped away. My dad tried. He made calls. He asked questions. He pushed where he could. But there are limits to what connections can do, especially in the early stages when there's no clear evidence of foul play, no clear location, no obvious direction to search. And then days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The search slowed. Not officially, but in that quiet way where resources get redirected and urgency fades. Flyers came down. Calls became less frequent. Life, cruelly, kept moving forward for everyone except the family. The brother was never found. Not alive, not dead. Just gone. What my dad witnessed over the years afterward wasn't just grief. It was erosion. A slow, grinding loss that didn't have a shape or an end point. The family didn't get closure. They didn't get answers. They didn't even get certainty. They existed in a suspended state. Every phone call carried a spike of hope and dread. Every unknown number felt like it might finally be the one. Every rumor, every possible sighting, every discovery of unidentified remains reopened the wound. And then, nothing. Year after year passed. The family aged, parents got older, lives changed. But the missing brother remained frozen at the age he disappeared. Forever suspended in possibility. Not dead enough to mourn fully. Not alive enough to hope safely. My dad stayed in touch with his friend through all of it. He watched the slow descent, not into madness, but into something quieter and more devastating. A kind of resigned grief that never resolves. At some point, the family stopped talking about when he comes back and started saying if. That shift alone is heartbreaking. Then, many years later, the call came. They found him. It wasn't immediate relief. It wasn't even shock in the way people expect. It was more like the collapse of a long-held tension, the kind that leaves you exhausted rather than emotional at first. His body was found at the bottom of a well. Not buried, not hidden, not murdered, just there. The realization hit everyone at once. It had been night when he went missing. He had been drinking. Not heavily, just enough to dull awareness, enough to slow reaction time, enough to make darkness more dangerous. The well wasn't marked clearly. It wasn't secured. It was just there, open, waiting in the dark. The most likely explanation is also the most tragic and mundane. He didn't see it. He walked straight into it. No struggle, no mystery, just a single wrong step in the dark. My dad said the thing that haunted him most wasn't the death itself, but imagining the moment before it. That split second when the ground disappeared. When realization hit too late to matter. There's a strange mercy in the idea that he likely died on impact, that he didn't suffer long, that he wasn't trapped, injured, conscious, calling for help that would never come. Because the alternative is unbearable. The thought of being alive at the bottom of a well, injured, alone, unable to climb out, surrounded by darkness, with no one knowing where you are. That's a horror beyond words. My dad talked to his friend the night the body was identified. They didn't talk much about logistics or legal steps. That would come later. Instead, they had a long, deep, philosophical conversation. The kind that only happens when something final has settled in. They talked about randomness, about how fragile life is, about how easily an entire family's future can be altered by a moment that wasn't malicious or intentional. They talked about how different grief feels when there's an answer, even a terrible one. How knowing doesn't fix anything, but it stops the mind from inventing endless worse possibilities. They talked about guilt, about the impossible what-ifs. What if someone had walked with him? What if the well had been covered? What if he hadn't had that last drink? What if someone had checked sooner? None of it mattered anymore. Time doesn't rewind for explanations. What my dad said stuck with me most was how he described the family afterward. The pain didn't disappear, but it changed. It became grounded. Finite. Something they could finally place somewhere. They could mourn properly. They could say goodbye. They could stop living in the space between hope and despair. But the cost of that closure was enormous. Years of uncertainty, years of imagining, years of watching parents grow old without knowing what happened to their child. The well became a symbol of how cruelly simple some tragedies are. No villain, no conspiracy, no warning, just darkness, alcohol, and an unmarked hazard. It's unsettling because it strips away the idea that horrible things only happen for dramatic reasons. Sometimes they happen because the world is careless, and humans are fragile. Every time I think about this story, I think about how many similar wells exist in different forms. Places, moments, decisions that seem harmless until they aren't. I think about how many disappearances end not with crimes or monsters, but with accidents that hide themselves too well. And I think about how much damage uncertainty does, how waiting can be worse than knowing, how families can survive grief but struggle endlessly with unanswered questions. Whether it was 12 years or 20 almost doesn't matter. The time blurred together in suffering. What matters is that he was missing long enough for hope to become habit, and then memory, and then pain. This story stays with me not because it's dramatic, but because it's quiet, because it could happen to anyone, because there was no intention, no malice, no warning, just a step into darkness, and a family that spent years wondering where their son had gone. That's what makes it terrifying. Not the well, but how easily it all happened. Sorry to interrupt for just a moment. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Sleepy Shadows for daily calm horror stories made for late nights and sleep. You can also turn on notifications so you don't miss a new story when the night gets quiet and the shadows return. Now, let's continue. In the year 2000, in a quiet residential neighborhood of Tokyo, something happened that still refuses to make sense more than 2 decades later. It wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't a spontaneous act or something that escalated out of control. It was deliberate, methodical, and deeply unsettling in ways that go far beyond the violence itself. A family of 4 lived in a modest home in Setagaya, a peaceful area known for being safe, orderly, and unremarkable in the way many Japanese neighborhoods are. The father, mother, and their 2 young children lived ordinary lives. They weren't wealthy. They weren't involved in anything unusual. There was nothing about them that suggested they were at risk. And yet, sometime during the night, someone broke into their home. What followed was brutal, and every member of the family was murdered. The parents were killed. The children were killed. There was no mercy shown. No attempt to spare anyone. The violence was close, personal, and sustained. This was not someone acting in a moment of panic or fear. This was someone who had time, control, and intent. But the murders themselves are only part of what makes this case so disturbing. After killing the entire family, the intruder did not flee. Instead, the killer stayed. For hours. They moved freely through the house as if it belonged to them. They helped themselves to food from the family's refrigerator. They sat down and ate. They used the bathroom. They did not flush the toilet afterward. They rummaged through belongings. They interacted with the home in a way that suggested comfort, not urgency. At some point, they even lay down. Personal items were left behind. Clothing, fingerprints, DNA, objects that should have made identification inevitable. This wasn't a careful criminal covering their tracks. In many ways, it felt like the opposite, like someone who either didn't care about being caught or wanted to be noticed. When the bodies were discovered, investigators were stunned by how much evidence had been left behind. The house was full of clues. There were fingerprints that didn't belong to the family. There was DNA. There were traces of the killer's movements throughout the house. There were items believed to belong to the attacker that had no connection to the victims. There were even food remnants that showed what the killer had eaten while inside the home. It was as if the crime scene had been preserved specifically to be studied. And yet, despite all of this, the killer has never been identified. Years passed, then decades. The evidence was analyzed again and again. Advances in forensic science were applied. DNA was re-examined. International databases were checked. Genetic markers suggested the killer may not have been Japanese, which added another layer of complexity. Possibilities ranged from a foreign national to someone with mixed ancestry. None of it led anywhere definitive. Every promising lead collapsed. Every theory stalled. The sheer contradiction of the case is what continues to haunt people. This wasn't a clean crime. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't subtle. It was messy, invasive, and deeply personal. And yet, the person responsible simply vanished back into the world. What kind of person kills an entire family and then calmly eats their food? What kind of mindset allows someone to remain in the home afterward, unbothered by the bodies in nearby rooms? What kind of confidence does it take to leave behind DNA, fingerprints, and personal items without apparent concern? Some investigators believe the killer felt untouchable. Others believe they were deeply disturbed and disconnected from reality. Some suspect the crime was meant to send a message, though no message has ever been found. Others think it was random, which is somehow even more terrifying. Because if it was random, it means there was no reason, no warning, no pattern. Just the wrong house at the wrong time. The family had no chance. The house itself adds another eerie layer to the story. After the murders, it became a symbol of unresolved horror, a place frozen in time by what happened inside it. In a culture that values order, privacy, and quiet, the violence felt especially jarring. People struggled to understand how such a thing could happen there. Neighbors reported nothing unusual that night. No screams heard, no disturbances noticed. No one saw someone fleeing the area. The killer came and went like a ghost. The idea that someone could commit such an act and then blend back into everyday life is what unsettles people the most. That the killer could be alive today, living normally, working a job, having conversations, walking past families without anyone knowing what they had done. The case has become infamous not because of a dramatic chase or courtroom battle, but because of its emptiness, its silence, the absence of resolution. Every year the anniversary comes and goes. Investigators revisit the case. The media outlets write new summaries. People online discuss theories, and every time it ends the same way. No arrest, no answers, just the lingering knowledge that someone did this and was never held accountable. There is something uniquely disturbing about crimes where the perpetrator lingers, where they don't rush to escape, where they treat the aftermath as an extension of the act itself. It blurs the line between violence and intrusion, between murder and occupation. The Setagaya murders feel less like a single moment of horror and more like an invasion that never truly ended. The killer didn't just take lives. They occupied the space those lives existed in. They used the family's home, their food, their bathroom, their privacy. They erased the boundary between victim and intruder completely. But that violation is what continues to resonate. More than the bloodshed, more than the forensic mystery. It's the idea that safety can be dismantled so thoroughly, so casually, that a home can be turned into a crime scene and then back into a living space for the killer, if only temporarily. That evidence doesn't always lead to justice, and that sometimes, despite everything, the person responsible simply disappears into the background noise of the world. The Setagaya family murders remain unsolved, not because there was nothing to work with, but because even overwhelming evidence doesn't guarantee closure. And that may be the most unsettling truth of all. Some stories don't end. They just stay open, waiting. I still remember exactly where I was when I read it. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No phone call, no sirens, no warning. Just an ordinary day and a newspaper headline that stopped me cold. The name jumped out immediately. It was someone I went to school with. Not a stranger, not a distant acquaintance. Someone I had known growing up. Someone who had been genuinely smart. Not just good at tests, but intelligent in a way that made people assume success was inevitable. Teachers liked him. Other students respected him. He had talent, confidence, and the kind of future everyone expects to turn out well. And for a long time, it did. He became a lawyer, built a career, bought a beautiful home, married, had 2 small children. From the outside, it looked like the kind of life people point to as proof that hard work pays off, was the kind of life that gets quietly admired, even envied. Then I read that he had killed his entire family, and then himself. There was no context in the article that made it make sense, no explanation that tied things together neatly. Just facts laid out in black and white. A man, a wife, 2 children, all dead. And then the final line that he had taken his own life afterward. I remember staring at the page, reading it again and again, as if repetition might change the meaning. As if maybe I had misunderstood something. As if there was another person with the same name. There wasn't. The shock didn't come all at once. It came in waves. First disbelief, then confusion, Then something heavier, harder to define. A kind of sickness in the chest that doesn't go away quickly. What messed with me the most wasn't just the crime itself. It was the contrast. The disconnect between who I remembered and what he had done. The impossibility of lining up the person from my past with the person described in the article. This wasn't someone who had been violent in school. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't known for anger or instability. If anything, he was composed, focused, driven. The type of person adults pointed to and said, "That kid's going places." And he did, until he didn't. I started thinking back through memories I hadn't touched in years. School hallways, classrooms, conversations that seemed meaningless at the time. I tried to find clues retroactively, like people always do after something horrible happens. Was there something off about him? Did he ever seem angry in a way I ignored? Did he say something that should have stood out? The honest answer is no. If there were warning signs, they weren't visible to me. And that realization is almost as unsettling as the crime itself, because it means that sometimes people carry entire worlds inside them that no one else ever sees. The article mentioned his career, his home, his family. It painted a picture of stability, the kind of life that looks complete from the outside, the kind of life that, statistically speaking, isn't supposed to end this way. But statistics don't protect against human collapse. I found myself thinking about his wife, about his children, about what their final moments might have been like, about the trust they had in him, about how the person meant to protect them became the one who took their lives. That thought is unbearable. There is something uniquely horrifying about family annihilation. It violates a fundamental assumption we carry without realizing it. The idea that home is safe, that family is a boundary violence doesn't cross. When that boundary breaks, it leaves nothing solid behind. What I struggled with most was the lack of answers. The article didn't say why. No clear motive, no dramatic backstory, no obvious financial collapse or public scandal. Just a life that appeared intact, and then suddenly wasn't. People often want these stories to have explanations that make them feel safer. They want to believe it only happens to people who are visibly unstable, or desperate, or obviously troubled. This case didn't offer that comfort. It suggested something far more disturbing. That a person can build an entire life that looks successful, loving, and normal, and still be quietly unraveling in ways no one notices until it's too late. I thought about pressure, about expectations, about the kind of internal strain that comes from always being the smart one, the successful one, the person who isn't supposed to fail. I thought about how difficult it can be for people like that to admit they're struggling, how asking for help can feel like admitting defeat, how silence becomes easier than vulnerability. None of that excuses what he did. Nothing ever could. But understanding the environment that allows something like this to happen feels important. Not to justify it, but to recognize how fragile the systems we rely on really are. I also thought about how quickly narratives change. Before, his story was one of success. After, it became something else entirely. And everything he had accomplished was instantly overshadowed by the worst thing he ever did. That's the strange cruelty of memory. One act can erase decades of context. I wondered how his former classmates felt reading the same article. How many people stopped mid-sentence when they recognized the name? How many people felt that same hollow drop in their stomach? I wondered how teachers reacted. Mentors, colleagues, people who had invested time and belief in him. And I wondered how many of them, like me, went searching their memories for signs that weren't there. The most unsettling realization is that sometimes there is no satisfying explanation. No single moment where everything clearly went wrong. just a slow accumulation of things no one else could see. The article didn't linger. It moved on, as newspapers do, one story among many. Another tragedy filed away for readers to process and then forget. But I couldn't forget it. Even years later, it comes back to me randomly. When I hear about similar cases, when someone talks about how well someone's life seems to be going, when success is treated like proof of inner stability, it reminds me that appearances are not evidence, that intelligence doesn't equal emotional safety, that accomplishment doesn't mean peace, and that the most dangerous breakdowns are often the quiet ones. I don't tell this story to shock people. I tell it because it changed how I think about others. It made me more cautious about assumptions, more aware that everyone is carrying something, whether we see it or not. It also changed how I think about help, about how important it is to create spaces where people can admit they're not okay without feeling like they're destroying their own identity. Because whatever was happening inside him, it went unheard until it exploded outward in the most irreversible way possible. The tragedy isn't just that he died. It's that 2 innocent children and a woman who trusted him died too, and that whatever pain he was experiencing was never addressed before it became catastrophic. That story lives in my mind not as a mystery to be solved, but as a warning without clear edges. A reminder that human lives are more complex than resumes, houses, and family photos suggest. Sometimes the most frightening truths aren't about monsters hiding in the dark. They're about ordinary people living ordinary lives, collapsing in ways no one expects. And the silence that surrounds them right up until the moment it's broken forever. This is one of those memories that has never softened with time. If anything, it has sharpened. The details are still clear, and the feeling that came with it has never really gone away. I can think of it at random, years later, and it still hits the same way. Heavy, confusing, impossible to fully make sense of. It was New Year's Eve. We were supposed to stay the night at a friend's new place. They had just moved in, and everyone was excited about it. A new house always feels like a fresh start, especially around New Year's. There were plans to drink, hang out, ring in the new year together, and crash there afterward instead of driving home late. Nothing about it felt unusual or risky. It was exactly the kind of thing people do every year. My girlfriend and I went over with the expectation that we'd be staying, and we brought what we needed for the night. We had already mentally committed to being there until the next day. There was no backup plan, no intention of leaving early. The night itself started normally. People were talking, laughing, moving around the house, getting drinks, getting comfortable. There was that familiar New Year's energy in the air. Not wild, not chaotic, just relaxed and social. The kind of night that blends into all the other good nights you have with friends. And then, out of nowhere, something in me shifted. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anxiety, it wasn't a thought that something bad was about to happen. It was an urge. A sudden, overwhelming urge to leave. Not later. Not soon. Immediately. It felt ridiculous even as it was happening. I suddenly wanted to go home and play World of Warcraft more than I have ever wanted anything so trivial in my life. Not because something exciting was happening in the game, not because I had plans or commitments there. Just a raw, insistent need to be at home, alone, doing something completely ordinary. The urge didn't come with an explanation. It didn't come with images or warnings or dread. It was just there, strong, persistent, almost physical. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself I was being stupid, that it made no sense, that we were already there and everything was fine, that leaving would be rude and unnecessary. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Instead of fading, it got stronger. It started to feel unbearable to stay. like every minute I remained in that house. I was pushing against something inside myself that was screaming to leave. Eventually, I said something. I told my girlfriend I wanted to go home. She thought I was joking at first. When she realized I wasn't, she got annoyed. Rightfully so. We were supposed to stay. It was almost midnight. Everyone was settling in for the countdown. Leaving at that point made no sense. I didn't explain myself well because I couldn't. How do you explain something that doesn't have a reason? I didn't say I felt unsafe. I didn't say I had a bad feeling. I just insisted that I wanted to leave. That turned into an argument, a real one. She accused me of being selfish, of ruining the night, of picking a video game over our friends and over her. From her perspective, that's exactly what it looked like. And honestly, if I had been in her position, I probably would have said the same things. But I wouldn't back down. The more we argued, the more desperate I became. I didn't care how unreasonable I sounded. I didn't care how angry she was. I just needed to get out of there. I demanded we leave. Eventually, somehow, I won the argument. She agreed, clearly upset, and we gathered our things and left. There was tension between us as we said goodbye. I remember feeling guilty and annoyed with myself, even as we walked out the door. I remember thinking I had just created a stupid fight over nothing. We got in the car and drove home. By the time we got there, it was close to midnight. We didn't celebrate. We didn't toast. The mood was off. I sat down at my computer, logged into WoW, and tried to distract myself. I don't remember much about what I did in the game. I don't remember what zone I was in or what quest I was working on. What I do remember is my phone ringing. It was later that night. The house had burned down. Our friends didn't make it. The words didn't make sense at first. They didn't fit together in my head. I remember hearing them and thinking there must be some mistake. Fires happen, people get out, houses burn, not people. But this wasn't that. The fire had spread fast. Too fast. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already out of control. There was no escape. The people we had just been laughing with, the people we were supposed to spend the night with, were gone. I sat there in shock, staring at nothing. My girlfriend started crying, hard. The argument from earlier vanished instantly, replaced by something much heavier. Fear, grief, disbelief, and guilt. So much guilt. Not survivor's guilt in the abstract sense, but a very specific, very personal kind. We were supposed to be there. We had planned to stay. There was no reason we shouldn't have been in that house when the fire started. Except I insisted on leaving. I replayed the night over and over again in my head. The feeling, the argument, the moment we walked out the door. I kept asking myself the same questions, even though I knew they didn't have answers. Why did I want to leave so badly? Why that night? Why that moment? What would have happened if I hadn't said anything? What would have happened if my girlfriend had refused? What would have happened if I had given up and stayed? Those questions never stop coming. They don't fade with time. They just change shape. People sometimes try to frame stories like this as intuition or fate or something supernatural. I've never been comfortable with that. I don't claim to know why I felt what I felt. I don't claim that I was warned or protected or guided. All I know is that something in me demanded that I leave, and I listened. And because of that, I'm alive. That realization doesn't bring comfort. It brings weight. There's a strange loneliness that comes with being the person who left. People don't say it out loud, but you feel it. You feel separate from the tragedy in a way that's hard to explain. You were almost part of it, close enough to feel it burn past you. The memory of the argument haunts me in its own way. At the time, it felt like the worst part of the night. A pointless fight. A selfish demand. Later, it became the reason I was still breathing. That contradiction is impossible to reconcile. I think about my friends often, about what their last moments might have been like, about how they probably had no warning, about how normal everything felt right up until it wasn't. I think about how easily we could have been there too. And I think about how fragile the idea of control really is. How we like to believe our choices are guided by logic and intention, when sometimes they come from somewhere we don't understand at all. I don't tell this story often. When I do, I try to be careful. I don't want it to sound like I'm claiming something mystical or special. I don't want it to sound like I'm saying there was a reason they died, and I didn't. There wasn't. They didn't deserve it. We didn't earn survival. It was just a moment, a decision, an argument, a door closing behind us. Sometimes the smallest, most irrational choices are the ones that matter the most. Not because they're meaningful, but because the world is unpredictable in ways we can't prepare for. That night changed how I see instincts. Not because I think they're always right, but because I learned how powerful they can be, even when they make no sense. It also changed how I think about time, about how close we always are to moments that could split our lives into before and after. I still play video games sometimes. I still think about how absurd it was that World of Warcraft was the reason I gave for leaving. That detail feels almost cruel in its triviality. But I don't dismiss it, because that absurd urge is the reason I'm here to remember the people who didn't get to leave. And that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just fade away, they stayed with you. Each one was shared to feel real, quiet, and close. Moments that could happen to anyone. Moments where something felt wrong, or nearly did. If you'd like to keep listening to stories that linger long after they're told, consider subscribing to Sleepy Shadows. There are more waiting in the dark, and not all of them disappear by morning. Good night.